On the top of a remote hill by the village of Ain Dara in northern Syria, about 40 kilometers northwest of Aleppo, lie the remains of a 3,000-year-old temple. Excavated mostly in the 1980s, this remarkable archaeological site was sadly damaged in 2018 in the course of the Syrian civil war by Turkish air bombardment, destroying over half of the excavated temple. But until then, it represented one of the most distinctive sanctuaries in the region, dating to the early Iron Age. The layout of the temple, with a three-part structure consisting of a columned portico, an antechamber in the middle, and an inner hall, aligns closely with the description of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem in the Bible, and probably stems from the same broad tradition of religious architecture. But the most striking feature of the Ain Dara temple are the footprints. 4 gigantic footprints carved into the limestone blocks on the floor, 2 at the portico entrance, a single left footprint on the block in front of it, and another right footprint on the threshold between the antechamber and the inner hall. There's little doubt that what these represent are the footprints of the superhuman-sized deity striding into the sanctuary. The footprints at Ain Dara are a powerful illustration of a fundamental religious idea in the ancient Near East, namely that the temple was the home of the god, the place where the deity resided, and therefore where the divine presence could be made manifest. In most languages of the ancient Near East, temples were simply referred to as the house of the god, with the same word for house as would be used for any individual. A temple, then, at its most basic, was just where the god lived. It may also share characteristics with what we might term a palace, to the extent that the god was also a king, but the idea of temple as divine abode was the foundational concept out of which so many other ideas and practices were derived, from animal sacrifices to priestly activities to the internal architecture of these structures. What happens, though, when a temple is destroyed? What do you do when the home of your god and the place where you perform your acts of veneration and convene with the divine is conquered by an enemy and is no more? This was no doubt a sad situation that was encountered with some regularity in the ancient world, and it would be difficult to generalize regarding a typical reaction. But in at least one case that we can identify, it seems that the destruction of a temple prompted at least some worshippers of that temple's deity to completely reimagine this conception of divine presence. For this group, at least, the trauma of temple destruction and also of exile inspired a theological vision of a god whose temple was not an isolated structure on a remote hilltop, or even in the center of a city like Jerusalem, but consisted of the entirety of the heavens and the earth. This was a god for whom all of creation was his abode. In this lecture, we'll examine what is undoubtedly the best-known creation story from the ancient Near East, a story that has transcended its ancient Near Eastern context to become the most familiar religious conception of creation in the popular imagination. This is, of course, the story of creation in 7 days in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1. But while this is a story with which many people have at least a passing familiarity, those outside of biblical scholarship generally don't recognize the richness of this text in terms of its structure, patterns, and layers of meaning. In particular, no complete understanding of this chapter is possible without some awareness of the characteristics of temples in the ancient Near East, because, as I will endeavor to show, the entirety of creation in Genesis 1 is presented in the text as the temple of the God who is creator. The story in question, as the first chapter in the book of Genesis, stands at the very beginning of both the Jewish and Christian Bibles. Since the chapter essentially narrates the beginning of everything, what the text describes as God creating the heavens and the earth, it serves as a fitting introduction to the Bible as a whole. But the primacy of this story in the canonical arrangement of the Bible as we have it now does not actually reflect the place of this text in the history of the composition of the Bible. That is, the order in which the stories themselves were written. In fact, the conventional scholarly view is that Genesis chapter 1 is among the latest biblical texts to be written and added to the Bible, or at least later than the rest of the Torah or Pentateuch, the books of Genesis to Deuteronomy that form the first section of the Bible. Why would a later text be placed first? Well, this is actually not so hard to understand. Think of the contemporary practice in which subsequent editions of a book are reissued with a new preface or introduction. For popular books that sell many copies and go through multiple editions, one can sometimes find multiple prefaces, each one placed at the beginning and before the prior ones. So, for instance, a second edition of a book with a new updated preface will have that preface placed first because it reframes the original version of the book, recasts it in light of the new situation, the reception of the book since its original publication, and so forth. This general phenomenon that we might call revision through introduction, to borrow a phrase from the scholar Sarah Milstein, is a recognized method by which ancient scribes modified the texts that they had before them. By adding a new introductory passage to a previous text, one is able to recast the work as a whole without technically speaking changing the traditional text that was received. This was not the only method by which ancient scribes did their work of editing, but it was a significant one. What is the nature of this introductory addition that Genesis 1 represents? Within biblical scholarship, this 7-day creation story is typically attributed to a body of tradition known as the priestly source, or simply the letter P for short. That is, a set of texts associated with the priests of the temple in Jerusalem and their descendants. Under the conventional understanding, this priestly author was also responsible for compiling the ritual laws in the Torah, primarily the book of Leviticus with its instructions on animal sacrifices, but also the instructions for the wilderness tabernacle in the latter half of the book of Exodus, as well as additional laws in the book of Numbers. Alongside these laws, the priestly tradition includes a number of stories as well as genealogies involving the characters in the book of Genesis. More importantly, all of these texts share certain features of outlook, style, and vocabulary that are quite distinctive. In particular, an emphasis on concepts of order and holiness sets these texts apart from other texts in the Torah. Historically, the priestly source in the Torah is to be located during the time of the Babylonian exile, another point that has significant bearing on how we read these texts. While there's some debate about this among biblical scholars, I believe the best explanation for the nature of the priestly source as we have it is that it represents the codification of literary traditions associated with the former Jerusalem priesthood in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple itself in 586 BCE. When the city of Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar II, with its temple destroyed and its people exiled to Babylonia, The priesthood faced the acute need to preserve its literary traditions and its history, as well as to rethink their very identity in a world without a physical temple. The priestly source is the product of these efforts. This understanding of the historical context helps to explain the setting of the sacrificial laws within the idealized past of the wilderness tabernacle, as well as the distinctive ideology expressed in the text that we're focusing on here, that the destruction of the physical Jerusalem temple didn't imply the defeat of their God, because the entirety of creation, the heavens and the earth, is God's true temple. In addition, as we'll see, there are quite a number of details in this text that are reminiscent of ideas found in Mesopotamian creation accounts. And this would make perfect sense if, in fact, the priestly source took literary shape in the context of exile in Mesopotamia itself, in Babylonia.